Sim, ontem estava a
Olá, bom dia, Tiago, tudo bem?
Desculpa pelo atraso.
Não, não tem problema nenhum, foi muito tempo.
Onde é que eu coloco a minha pendura?
Não sei como tocar.
Talvez fosse só. Desse aqui.
Falta o José Augusto. Pois, eu primeiro, mas podemos trocar a ordem. Somos 5 minutos.
Zé deve estar vendo o jogo do Flamengo, deve ter visto o jogo do Flamengo. Ontem ficou até. Flamengo?
Sim.
Foi campeão.
Não sei, tô brincando, nem sei se teve jogo ontem. Tô brincando com ele.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be sharing this session dedicated to general topic Brazil. Judging from the speakers and the titles, I think we can expect an exciting panel. Hopefully, João Augusto will make it in a few minutes. I'll start by presenting Diogo Cabral. He's an assistant professor in environmental history and a member of the Trinity Centre for Environmental Humanities at the Trinity College Dublin, Ireland. He is the author of Na Presença da Floresta, Mata Atlântica e História Colonial, and he has co-edited Metamorfoses Florestais, Culturas, Ecologias e as Transformações Históricas da Mata Atlântica. And his article, Into the Bowels of Tropical Earth, Leaf-Cutting Ants and the Colonial Making of Agrarian Brazil, was awarded the 2015 Journal of Historical Geography Best Paper Prize. Diogo's research focuses on multiple topics at the intersection of geography, environmental history, multi-species studies, and landscape ecology, with an emphasis on non-human agency and multi-species entanglements. And he's currently co-editing a collection on the more than human history of Latin America to be published by the University of London Press. And he's going to present a paper titled Geoecologies of Empire, Space Natural Resources, and the Making of the Sugar Nobility in Colonial Brazil. The floor is yours.
Thank you. If you guys don't mind, yeah. No, I was thinking of standing, if that's all right. Susana, você pode passar?
Com certeza.
Mas não, eu mesmo posso, porque...
Mas isto é do meu.
Give me that.
Wait.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Okay. Well, yeah, let me thank Professor Bittencourt again for not only inviting me, but putting this together, which is just, it's just an amazing gathering of scholars. And when Professor Bittencourt contacted me, I was a bit hesitant because I didn't have anything new to present here. I had moved on to, I used to be an environmental historian of colonial Brazil years ago. Well, maybe I still am, but I kind of moved on to the 19th and early 20th century now. But I was so excited to participate in this event that I decided to revisit something I had written years ago, but not published. And so I had this idea of putting together an amazing team of scholars, something like Avengers thing. With Ana Lunara Moraes, this is an interesting team because I am a geographer / environmental historian. Ana Moraes is a social historian, and Cristiane Barreto is a biologist, environmental scientist. So it's a very, very multidisciplinary team. But yeah, I'll stick to the script here, and then now and then I'm gonna do unscripted comments. Most of the recent scholarship on early modern European colonialism in the tropics focuses on the social and environmental impacts of empire, and very little on the influence of physical geographies on human settlement and politics. For example, a particular historiography about the Portuguese Empire has emerged over the last 30 years, focusing on the transposition of old regime institutions to tropical spaces. I'm talking about the so-called ART historiography, Antigo Regime nos Trópicos, the Antigo Regime nos Trópicos school, right? Drawing heavily on Italian microhistory, these historians turn to serial documents such as notary parish records to understand the formation of colonial Brazil through the functioning of political administrative institutions, especially from the point of view of social networks. Undoubtedly, this approach has produced highly innovative, consistent, relevant historical knowledge. It helped to redefine central aspects of colonial history, such as metropolitan exploitation, slave life, the constitution of local elites, and the role of Brazil in the Portuguese Empire. However, possibly due to the micro-historical emphasis on individual human lives and trajectories, these historians tend to neglect the non-human beings and things in cooperation with which people conceived and acted upon the world. Here, I will present some preliminary results of an ongoing multidisciplinary project that adds an environmental history layer to the ART framework. For this, we combined archival-based investigation of family trajectories with GIS-based landscape analysis. So, before going into data analysis proper, let me briefly discuss our conceptual framework. This was my departure point. I mentioned that I had to revisit some things that I had written before. This is the thing. It is worth noting that while some ART scholars do engage with notions related to the biophysical world, they tend to empty them of any analytical value. Professor João Fragoso, for example, in one of his works on 17th century Rio de Janeiro, defined ecology as the scenario, where historical subjects build their social networks based on ingrained notions such as Catholicism, corporatism, and municipal autonomy. Thus, ecology becomes an abstract stage upon which people make history. In this regard, one must recall the classic comment by the French geographer Paul Vidal de la Blache, for whom the stage, I'm quoting, "the stage itself is alive," end of quote. So the activities and properties of this living stage empower or disempower humans to pursue their social and political projects. But how can we apply this theoretical principle to the writing of Portuguese America's social history? There are clues in the work of historian Antonio Manuel Espanha, who strongly influenced ART historiography, and in a way was himself an author in this current of historiography. In his book, As Vésperas do Leviatã, Espanha drew attention to the circumstances, I'm quoting him, that objectively limit politics or define frameworks or scenarios for political action, end of quote. Studying Portugal's European territory, Espanha referred to the spatial distribution of population as an economic and military asset. However, it is possible to argue, especially when considering New World situations, that what he called the material conditions of power production must be extended to include the biophysical environment. Settlers, merchants, rulers saw Brazilian native lands as a geographically structured field of resources and risks they needed to know and control in order to organize an agricultural export economy. The most successful actors or human actors were those who obtained the best information about the natural and human landscape so as to direct their investments. The realization of these investments inevitably altered the biophysical landscape, redefining the scenario for subsequent actions. So, an important part, a key part of our theoretical structure is this idea of situ action or situação, hyphen, with a hyphen, and both in it works both in Portuguese and English, I suppose. So we use this word as a verb to theorize the positioning of oneself and others in the territory, a process that tends to distribute environmental burdens and bonuses unequally. In the Portuguese Empire's political ecological arena, the struggle for positions in the social hierarchy required environmentally grounded actions. These spatial practices derived from calculations and negotiations between the interests and possibilities of different actors who sought to exercise their powers over people through the territory. Within the corporate limits of the old regime, each actor had a certain amount of what we could call spatial capital. That is, a set of skills and resources to territorialize their projects. This capital could be accumulated and used to produce other socially valuable assets, such as agricultural goods, marriages, offices. However, failures in this conversion generally undermine the process of social power accumulation. Although the land nobility, like everyone else in that society, sought out honor and prestige, these immaterial goals were firmly rooted in the biophysical world. Thus, our crucial theoretical point here is the inextricability of societal position and geoecological place. So, okay, empirically, in empirical terms, our project aims to understand the relationships between sugar production and the families or clans that appropriated coastal Brazil's natural resources to carve out plantations. From the 1530s, the Portuguese colonization of America relied on agriculture. It was mentioned here before, of course. The sugarcane model adopted in other Atlantic colonies, such as Madeira Island, proved viable and was replicated in Brazil, including Carthage's technology and the labor system, coerced labor, of course. Attempted at various regions in the Brazilian Atlantic forest, the sugarcane plantation was the very first large-scale agricultural undertaking on the American continent. It was based on land concessions by the Portuguese crown to individuals who had rendered services to the monarchy, mainly in the territorial conquest itself. Despite significant fluctuations in the global markets, sugar remained the principal export throughout the colonial period and a prominent vehicle for social climbing. As a rule, the most successful planters held military ranks and positions in the royal administration and local justice, giving them prestige that they usually reinvested in land and enslaved people. The family was a central institution in this process, shaping social reproduction strategies, whether conscious or not. The search for prominent social positions made it imperative to expand the family to maximize available resources, including access to government positions and the best sites for agricultural production. So our hypothesis here is that the social distinction of families, which gave rise to what became known as the land nobility, was made possible by combining several elements, with the strategic appropriation of land being a central factor. So a suitable case to test this hypothesis is Pernambuco in northeast Brazil. A recent work by one of us, I'm referring to Ana Lunara Moraes, explored the geographies of sugar mill founding as a critical element in the social ascendancy of certain clans between the 16th and 18th centuries. She found that these families concentrated their mills in certain parishes, suggesting the importance of owning quality and well-located land for constructing social power. However, it remains to be verified whether the spatial agglomeration resulted from a search for specific natural resources. We set out to do this by assembling a GIS project overlaying sugar mill locations and physical geographical attributes. The families we analyzed are two branches of the Albuquerque, Paz Barreto, Rego Barros, Vieira de Melo, Cavalcante, Carneiro da Cunha, and Camilo Pessoa. We followed these families from the moment they arrived or they were formed in Pernambuco between the 16th and early 17th centuries until the end of the 18th century. We mapped the sugar mills based on the crossing of geographic information contained in inventories, wills, disputes over mill ownership and inheritance, and documents of the West Indies Company, and the General Company of Commerce of Pernambuco and Paraíba, among other kinds of documentation. We also considered the current location of remaining mills, most of the times the ruins. So our first step was to try to visualize the spatial patterns of each family's sugar mills throughout the whole period under study, from the 16th to the 18th century, to the end of the 18th century. So we calculated the kernel density using the location of mills as points, right? We represented them as points using ArcGIS, the software ArcGIS. The warmer colors in the maps show the family's spatial preferences and whether they were concentrated in certain areas or not. So at this regional level of visualization, all 8 families show some degree of geographic concentration, although some more than others. The Vieira de Melos and the Albuquerques were the most concentrated. right? Uh, yeah, the Albuquerque and the Vieira de Melo. Probably they were the most concentrated, while the Rego Barros were the least concentrated. Next, we tried to, this was the most complicated, this was Cristiane's doing, and I had a hard time understanding actually the math behind it. But what we tried to do here was to model the family's locational preferences, assuming biophysical, of course, assuming that biophysical variables explain these patterns, right? So we employed the Maxent software, a software initially developed to model non-human species distributions. So we started with a very comprehensive data set containing the following variables: landform, proximity to a watercourse, geology, altimetry, soil type, soil pH, and what she called geoenvironmental unit, which is kind of a combination of geomorphological and biological attributes. And we eventually discarded the first two variables, landform and proximity to watercourse, because of collinearity. So there is this measure called the percent contribution, which shows how much each variable contributes to the model's prediction. And the permutation importance, PI, which is another measure, shows how much the model's prediction changes when each variable is permutated. The higher the PC, the percent contribution value, the more significant is the variable's contribution to explaining the model. The model meaning the family's location choices, right? And the higher the PI, the permutation importance, the greater the variable's irreplaceability. We highlighted the area under the receiver operator curve, AUC, in yellow, which measures predictive accuracy, which means the model's statistical reliability. The results suggest that the biophysical variables had different roles in the spatial selectivity of the families. For some of them, like the Albuquerque, one of the Albuquerque branches, soil pH was the crucial attribute. For other families, such as the Carneiro da Cunha and Camilo Pessoa, the type of soil and the geoenvironmental unit were the most relevant variables. Finally, for the Rego Barros, the topography or altimetry was the central variable. This diversity supports the hypothesis of the existence of not one, but multiple spatial strategies, which means that for each family sought different things. They had different parameters, in a sense, to choose between the sites available. But I had to say, I was talking to Cristiane before coming here. This is not a very strong statistical result, right? I mean, we are arguing that this suggests the possibility that each family had a different orientation, so to speak, in choosing between sites. But let's put it this way: this wouldn't be accepted in a hard science paper as a statistical result. So next, we zoomed in on the role of soil types. Okay. There is qualitative evidence that the kind of soil directly impacted the quality of sugar in Pernambuco. Not only in Pernambuco, but we are focusing on Pernambuco here. For example, in 1768, 31 planters signed a document requesting the maintenance of the Sugar Inspection Board, created in 1752, but whose operation was met with resistance from some mill owners. The signatories asked that the board's president and inspectors, not the producers themselves, carry out the categorization and weighing of sugars. They argued that there were more than 300 sugar mills in Pernambuco, endowed with the most diverse types of soil, resulting in very different qualities of sugar. Therefore, the board was essential to standardize exports Although they do not describe the soils used for planting sugarcane, it is clear that the planters were aware of which kinds of soils they considered the best ones. There are other sources mentioning the so-called massapés. They're very famous in Brazilian historiography, which were clayey, humid soils with a high content of organic matter, presumably located in river flood plains. In the early 18th century, an Italian Jesuit living in Bahia wrote that, I'm quoting, if the plantation owner does not know the quality of the land, he will buy salões. Salões is another term for sandier, poor soils. He will buy salões as if they were massapés, which are black, fertile lands, which are the most excellent for cane planting. End of quote. However, it is not easy to correlate the historical folk taxon with the scientific taxa that underlie modern pedological soil science cartography. In our study area, the two soil types with properties most similar to those of massapé are clay soils and OT soils. In a previous work, my own, I argued that OT soils were the most sought after because they were located on slopes and therefore better drained. On the other hand, the newly cleared clay soils produced lush but very watery canes with a very low sucrose content, which is why they needed to be braved first. Desbravar. The term in Portuguese was desbravar. Braved with cassava crops. However, as I will show in a minute, we found evidence that the clay soils were actually the most sought after, suggesting that braving paid off. So we calculated the areas occupied by the different soil types on the properties based on a square league around the points representing the sugar mills. Then we calculated the percentages and grouped them by family and historical period. We used the soil types present in the official soil map of Brazil put together by Embrapa and in partnership with IBGE. As a parameter, we calculated the relative participation of the different soil types in a region of up to 20 kilometers around each mill, expressed in the first line of the graph. Region, right, the first line. The different proportions compared with this regional parameter suggest a preference for specific soil types. In particular, the Cavalcante family seem to have preferred clay soils. Although less abundant in the broader regions where their mills were located, clay soils predominated in a good part of their properties, notably the oldest ones. In summary, these graphs suggest that the families chose areas for mills non-randomly, and that selection may have been driven by soil type. So the early appropriation of prime and natural resources has been crucial for some families to consolidate themselves amongst the sugar nobility. Take the case of the Cavalcante, who I just mentioned. They originated from one of the children that Jerônimo de Albuquerque, son-in-law of Pernambuco Captain Cisdonatry, had with the daughter of a local indigenous chief. This child, Catarina de Albuquerque, would later marry the Florentine nobleman Felipe Cavalcante, who arrived in Brazil probably in the 1550s and soon entered the sugar business. In the 16th and especially in the beginning of the 17th century, the Cavalcante patriarch and his heirs successfully seized the clay soils in northern Pernambuco. One of the family's most long-lived mills, the Musumbu, which remained family property for about 150 years, had 82% of clay soils. Together with Três Paus, the other mill that the Cavalcante acquired in the early 17th century, they add up to the highest proportion of clay soil ever amassed among all the families and in all the periods we analyzed. This suggests that not only were clay soils, or should we say massapé, targeted as prime resources, but their productive properties helped the Cavalcante take firm roots and ennoble themselves over time. The richness of the soil was profound, famously wrote 20th century sociologist Gilberto Freire about the Massapê. Generations of planters could succeed each other on the same plantation and strengthen themselves. End of quote. So, to conclude, our study shows promising, even though, of course, very tentative evidence that Pernambucan sugar planters were spatially selective in building mills, and that these geographical strategies were consequential for their families' overall success. Our findings empirically support a common but little documented claim in the historiography that Massapés, probably glacials, were crucial for the rise of sugar nobilities. Hogging those territories containing glacials were vital for building well-to-do, powerful clans. However, qualitative sources indicate that the Massapés needed to be managed to become prolific cane producers. Assuming they correspond, in fact, to glacials, modern pedological studies show that monoculture may impact their physical properties, for example, through soil compactation. But even in this case, the drawback could have been offset by more stable benefits, such as the absence of leaf-cutting ants, which have difficulty building nests in glacials due to their excessive stickiness. In any case, our study supports the argument that to become tropical, the Portuguese old regime entangled itself in the biophysical configurations of the Atlantic forest. Rather than engineering local ecosystem, as archaeologist Kathleen Morrison would probably have it, Portuguese early modern colonialism in Brazil emerged as such in its inextricable relations with the local land. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dio. Thank you for this very interesting paper and also for the interdisciplinary approach. Now, yeah.
Esse é meu. Obrigado.
Did you send it to me? Yes,
I sent it this morning, but
I didn't receive it. Okay.
But this,
Thank you.
I need the.
Pode fechar mesmo.
É, acho bom. Este é o seu.
Não, esse é o meu. Deve estar.
This is the perception.
Uhum.
Okay, so I will briefly introduce José Augusto Pado. He is professor of Brazilian environmental history at the Institute of History, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where he's also one of the coordinators of the Laboratory of History and Nature. From 2010 to 2015, he was president of the Brazilian Association of Research and Graduate Studies on Environment and Society. He's a fellow of the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich. He integrated the creation team and is a member of the scientific board of the Museum of Tomorrow, inaugurated in Rio de Janeiro in 2016. And as a specialist of environmental history and politics, he gave talks, courses, and participated in field works in more than 40 countries. And he published many books and articles in Brazil and abroad, including a book. Sorry, can't read. Sorry. Small technical issue. Yeah, that's right. The book including A Living Past, Environmental Histories and Modern Latin America, published by Bertrand in 2019. José Augusto.
Okay. Good morning, and first of all, sorry for the delay. It's good that we made this solution. I'm very happy that you were able to do it. I would need the PowerPoint. Is it?
Wait, but we did what? Não,
Pode fechar esse.
Cá não abrimos.
Okay, I made a change in the title and for political perceptions of environmental deterioration. I'll try to explain why. In 1823, a man of science who became the leader of Brazilian independence, José Bonifácio, he sent two documents to the Constitutional Assembly of the new empire. One about the situation of the indigenous peoples, and the other about the problem of slavery, the slavery problem. In these documents, he made a kind of assessment of the reality of Brazil at that time and the prospects for nation building, what we could call nation building. And the main task would be to overcome slavery, because he said slavery was a cancer that gnaws at the bowels of Brazil. But in the last part of this document about slavery, he said that, I'm quoting, "Nature has done everything to help us, but we have done nothing to help nature. Our mountains and hillsides are daily balding. Our precious forests are disappearing, victimized by fire and by the destructive acts of ignorance and selfishness. And in time, there will be a shortage of the fertile rains that appease the vegetation and feed our watersheds and rivers, without which our beautiful land of Brazil will be reduced in less than 2 centuries to the condition of the empty plains and arid deserts of Libya. The day, a terrible and fatal day, will then come when scorned nature will have completed its revenge against so many mistakes and crimes committed against it." The first time I read this document, I was very surprised. In 1823, someone speaking in such an apocalyptic tone about nature destruction. And there are many interesting things here. For example, the broad political use he made of the desiccation theory. And this idea that in the limit, Brazil could become a desert. On the other sense, it's very interesting for us, especially here, the use he made of historical knowledge, making this comparison with Libya. And in fact, many of the reflections he did in the new context of Brazilian independence continues reflections he was making when he was living in Portugal. Because, for example, these uses of history in a document, the famous document about forests he published in 1815, he said, "All those who have studied the great influence of woods and forests in the general economy of nature knows that the countries who have lost their forests have become almost entirely sterile and depopulated. This happened with Syria, Phoenicia, Cyprus, and other lands, and is happening in our Portugal." So the Mediterranean was the focus of the perception of environmental deterioration at that time. But the main thing here is a question that many historians have been making. When did the ecological sensibility or ecological or environmental conscious arise in the modern world? At the beginning, there was a hasty political attribution to the late 20th century, the idea that ecological consciousness was a result of high-level industrial development and a result of affluent society development of what they call post-materialist values in affluent societies. So it was a result of high-level urban industrialization. But then historical research was helping to destroy this view that it was a new thing. In fact, of course, at the end of the 20th century, environmental discussion discussion became something quite strong in the public arena, in the public opinion, in cultural industry, international relations, etc., etc. But before that, in the world of academia, legislation, and management, it has been a reality since much time before. As we saw yesterday, many examples of legislation and practice. But there is a problem that I think is important, which is when there are different levels of what we can call environmental conscious. There is a very practical level. For example, a forester wanting to keep the forest practices happening, or fishermen paying attention to how to maintain the stocks of fish. Sometimes there are the creation of reserves to guarantee the hunting for aristocracy. So there are different levels. And the level that I am calling here the political level is for me the most important, and is what we properly can call environmental consciousness, which is this perception that a determinate society can suffer deterioration, decay, or even a collapse because of the mistreatment of the environment. So what we would now call in sustainability, this discussion on sustainability or insustainability. And there are many books about the history of ecological thought, or the history of environmental consciousness, and almost never they mention the Luso-Brazilian Enlightenment, or they mention Luso-Brazilian writers. But it's amazing the quality of the production and the documentation we have available. So this material I will share with you today shows that, in my opinion, this political environmentalism, political environmental perception is a modern phenomenon, but in a broader sense than advanced industrial world, included factors such as European colonial expansion, the global circulation of science, etc. And Richard Groves from Cambridge, a good friend, he made a pathfinder work discovering a lot of documents in the 18th and even 17th century. But he made this thesis that the cradle of perceived environmental destruction was the tropical world and the colonial, the European colonies in the tropical world. But according to him, this awareness started with government and company officials as a colonial government and company official agents. This is different from the Luso-Brazilian case, because in this case, it was not functionaries of the colonial system, but a kind of elite, a kind of intellectual elite of the colony that came to Portugal, came to Coimbra, and in Portugal, they started to make a collective reflection about the situation of Brazil. Of course, there was no such idea of environmentalism, of environment. Environment was not something separated. It was not a specific discussion. It was included in the discussion about slavery, about economy, about everything. And this is very interesting, because it's what we, jumping to the future, this is what we need for the future. Not to have environmental as a separate discussion, but as something inside the discussion about societies and about the future. And then we can make a kind of, first of all, how to come back here? I don't know. Okay. This group of authors that okay. go back, please. Go back. Yeah. Okay. So this group of authors I was able to find in different archives and libraries. They were not employees of the colonial companies. I'm a member of the local elite of Portuguese Americans. So there was a different political aim, but there are similar theoretical references. And we can put attention to the importance of Domenico Vandelli, of course, and the reformed University of Coimbra and the Lisbon Academy of Science. In several cases, these authors had the political support of Rodrigo de Souza Coutinho. And these are the authors I was able to find that discuss on quite a deep way the problems or the agenda of what we would call environmental agenda today. And Vandelli started this discussion because Vandelli said that agriculture was expanding along the borders of the rivers in the interior of Brazil, of the country, but with a method that in the future will reveal harmful, because consists of burning ancient forests whose wood would be very useful for naval construction and for cabinet making, etc. Once these forests are burned, the lands are cultivated for 2 or 3 years until the diminished fertility makes them abandon the plots in order to burn new sections of the forest. Of course, he got this information from his students that went back to different parts of Brazil at the beginning of the century, at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And Vandelli also was important because he made for the first time, as far as I know, the connection between this mistreatment of the environment of the forest, the bad quality of the agriculture, and slavery, because he said that the problem was that all agricultural tasks are performed by black slaves and no whites will stop down to being a farmer. The major reason why agriculture in Brazil will never grow very much. So he makes this. He made this connection that José Bonifácio would develop on a more deeper way when he come back to Brazil. And there are very interesting material in these authors, but I will just mention 2 cases that for me is interesting because give a clues for the whole discussion. One is this case of José Vieira Couto, a famous mineralogist that was living in Minas Gerais at the end of the 18th century. There is in this book, Memória sobre a Capitania das Minas Gerais, he made many environmental reflections, and sometimes very strong ones. He said, it seems that it's time to pay attention to these precious forests, these amenable woods that the Brazilian farmer is treating with total burning and destruction, with axe in one hand and firebrand in the other. A barbarian agriculture that is also much more expensive has been the cause of this general conflagration. The farmer gazes around and sees 2 or more leagues of forest as if he were looking at nothing. He saw the forest as nothing. And even before he finished reducing them to ashes, he is again gazing far away to take destruction elsewhere. He has no affection or love for the land that he cultivates because he knows well that will not last enough for his children. A hush field covered with stumps and thorns is what remains in his property. It's quite a strong language to talk about an agriculture that is destroying the land, destroying the forest. But the interesting thing, there are in many specific reflections, for example, he said that there are layers of excellent iron ore that will never be useful to anybody because the woods are so far away. So the scarcity of woods would produce also problems for mining. But what is really interesting is that in the same document, after doing this quite strong defense of a better attention, a better care about forests, etc., he said in the same document, I think I can already see a new horizon, a new skies. Thousands of herds cover the plains and release thick billows of smoke to the clouds. The rifts are being mined, and their rich entrails are vomited through their small mouths. The cacophony of 1,000 machines strike my ears. A laborious, content, and joyful people walks the surface of the earth in large groups. So it's ironic because and this is a general point about these authors. They saw, they understood what we now call environmental destruction, not as a price of progress, but as a price of backwardness, as an archaic heritage of slavery, of mistreatment of the land, deforestation. And the panacea would be modernity, would be the industrial world, in fact. He is seeing the industrial world, the industrial mining, as the future. for a good treatment of the environment. It's quite ironic, seen from the perspective of the present. And by the way, research being done by my friend and colleague Antoine Acker in Brazil shows that the beginning of oil exploration in Brazil, the defenders, the engineers that were trying to find oil in Brazil, all their argument was based in the defense of the forests. They said that oil will keep our forests for the future. The forests are being destroyed, but oil will be the solution. It's quite ironic to see this from a broad historical perspective. But the other author that is even more surprising author is this almost forgotten name. Can you go back here? This almost forgotten author called José Gregório de Moraes Navarro. He was he went to Coimbra, then he went back to Brazil. He became a judge, and he wrote this book. This is booklet about the betterments of the rustic economy of Brazil. 5 minutes, okay. With the introduction of the plow, the reform of the furnaces, and the conservation of the forests. And also, he also had the plantation of trees and recovering of the land with. But he started his analysis saying, with a planetary perspective, a view of the planet as an entity reminds us of course, in a very completely different context, it will be anachronic, but it reminds us of Gaia, this discussion of Gaia, because he said, of all the elements that God created for his glory and for the use of men, none is more worth of contemplation than the earth, the mother of all living creatures. She still gives us the same protection that she offered to those born in the beginning of the world. Not even the immense multitude of families, not the terrible flood that it suffered with its sinful children, not the numerous revolutions that so many times have almost thrown her off of her axis. So he's mixing biblical images with Enlightenment science. But he said, not the long succession of centuries change and were able to sterilize the fruitful germ of her fertility of the earth. But he said, despite the ungratefulness of man, who seems to work continuously to destroy and annihilate her natural production and to consume and weaken her primitive substance. And so the starting is very interesting, but then he came to the Minas Gerais case. He was from Minas Gerais, and he said, the colonizers of Brazil successfully found large cities and many other small places. But how are these old population centers today? They resemble lifeless bodies. This is so because the neighboring farmers who supply them with their basic goods, with their agriculture, after reducing all trees to ashes, after depriving the land of its most vigorous substance, left it covered with grasses and ferns, and abandoned their houses, mills, workshops, establishing themselves in new plots. This is an agenda of analysis for Brazilian history, Brazilian environmental history, that few people are still going on with this research. The abandonment of farmers or even cities. I know a beautiful book about the abandonment of cities in the Negro River in the Amazon region in the 19th century. But we had examples of farms and of course, gold digging and other forms of exploitation, even in small villages that were abandoned because of lack of food and all these problems created by what we would not call environmental agenda. So this is just a small glimpse of the richness of the reflection that were being made in Portugal and Brazil at that time. And it's a shame that it's not part of the history of environmental ideas. And so this is the first point, to show that this tradition of thought and Luso-Brazilian Enlightenment specifically In this case, I encountered very little romantic sensibility, because also romantic sensibility was part of the. Can you go back just one slide? One more. One more. No, sorry. Go back, please. So, go
Forward.
forward. Okay, here. So the rise of this political environmental consciousness, which is political in the sense that they were concerned about the decay and maybe the collapse of Minas Gerais, of Brazil, based on environmental destruction. Okay, but I think we must consider two aspects: the intense and rapid landscape modifications, objective factors. Objective, but also subjective ones, cultural ones, because it's not enough to have environmental problems. It's important to have conceptual tools to understand it and create and enforce a critique. And so at that time, the vision, Linnaeus, the system of nature, economy of nature, desiccation theory, and also the romantic sensibly were the main conceptual tools, theoretical tools that were used by these men of sciences to understand the problem. Bonifacio himself explained when he wrote about the whales, when he criticized the hunting of whales in Brazil, he said, in 1790, he said, armed with the study of natural sciences, he recalled the disorders observed in some of the whale traps in Brazil. So the memory of what he saw in Brazil became something important, became a problem to be criticized when he discovered himself armed with the study of the natural sciences. So this encounter, this interaction between subjective and objective aspects, it's important to understand the rise of environmental consciousness, not only in the Luso-Brazilian Enlightenment, but also in other countries. But in our case, romanticism is not very strong. What I saw more is a kind of anthropocentric, scientific view, trying to mix progress and economic progress with care for nature. Close to what we today would probably call sustainable development. Close to this kind of perspective. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, José Augusto, for bringing us the Luso-Brazilian environment as a case study and the discussion for determining the moment when environmental awareness emerges. Now I'm going to open the floor for discussions. I'll take, okay, so. Okay, we'll start with José. Okay.
Thank you both for your presentations. I have a question for José Augusto Padua, which basically is also a question for, I think, for the entire, for all of us here. So basically, I'm far from being a specialist in environmental history, but you were talking at some point about this idea when there is this breakthrough about, environmental thought and thinking and concerns. And it reminds me about a very now long discussion on human rights between, for instance, Lehnhand and Samuel Moyn. Lehnhand saying that human rights can be traced back to the French Revolution, to the ideas, to epistolary writings, etc. And Samuel Moyn says, no, human rights were created only in the mid-20th century, and they were just the big breakthrough, when there was the vernacularization of human rights was in 1970. So what I'm asking here is, I'm a contemporary historian, I don't know that much about previous periods and more remote periods, but this idea of discussing where was the breakthrough is not a very bad way of us trying to interact people who are working on very different periods. What I'm trying to say is that instead of thinking about breakthroughs, when was it created? should we not think about, yes, can we find a synthesis about, yes, there were, for instance, concerning human rights, concerns about human empathy and the idea of human equality back in the 18th century. But human rights as they emerged in the 20th century are pretty much different. They were something connected to, as a jurisdiction that was beyond the state, not confined to the state. So my question here is, instead of being discussing when this all started, if we can try to think about important genealogies, but also about, sometimes I think what is contemporary, for instance, sustainable development is not the same thing about concerns about environment. Sustainable development is kind of a doctrine that emerged at some point that is precisely connected. So obviously there are, antecedents to that. There are previous discussions about environment. So what I'm trying to think here is, can we make a synthesis and try to make this dialogue? Could we make this dialogue more fruitful between people working on different chronologies, trying to acknowledge, for instance, origins, but also important differences? For instance, the idea of sustainable development has a very precise history and is enforced by international institutions. Okay, nowadays no one cares about international institutions, unlike the last warrior about international institutions, but they have the ability of, making such a concept get into everyone's lives in a certain way or not. And in this case, I will go back to, all, dialectic materialism when quantitative changes produce qualitative changes. So one thing is some intellectuals thinking about environment. The other thing is everyone since the 80s and the 90s in the schools, in the TVs, etc., being kind of bombed with sustainable development. So these are different ways of thinking about environment, and at some point we also have, I think, some of these discussions are pretty much kind of an intellectual issue, but to know the power of the ideas, we also have to know how these ideas were spread, how they were integrated, how,
Okay.
ex-global they.
Okay, thank you. Now we have other questions, Katja. Yeah.
I think the question is global, and it's a question that came yesterday with the executive. I think we're doing three things at the same time here. One is what Secretary just mentioned, the history of the idea and the concept and how people react to it. The second is the intersection of different players during colonial times. And I think that Zé introduced yesterday, and now with really, I'd like to congratulate you and your colleagues on what you've done, which is basically doing what I, as an economic historian, try to do with correlations. And I know that from the point of view of the numbers, there are reasons to be skeptical, but for historians, I think you can sell these pretty much as hard science. So I'll keep your self-criticism. I'm not sure whether I agree with your self-criticism that much. I wouldn't be too arguing on that. But I would like to go back and then just give you a small push and wonder whether you have demonstrated, I think, without doubt, that there is a correlation between spatial capital, what you have called spatial capital, which I think is really good, social capital, that you not mentioned, that you hinted at, the mobility of the sugar is nothing else but social capital, and of course investment strategies. You've made this correlation, so I think I have two very direct questions. One is, can we add up to Bourdieu's idea of capitals? And one of the capitals that Bourdieu did not put on the table is this spatial capital. That is point one. I think you have enough in this case study to demonstrate that it's possible theoretically, but also in practice. The second point, which I found very interesting, is that I think you've demonstrated something that you do not acknowledge. Possession of land does not matter. Possession of specific types of land matter. And I think that this discussion should be brought in at some point because it does not matter that Europeans take the land from autochthonous populations. It matters that a specific type of land is taken away from autochthonous populations, and that the deletion of the specific types of land actually have more or less impact on the whole land for Christianity. So that is my question, and this connects very strongly with the idea of the same terra, the peoples mostly in the Americas, but also the tragedy of the commons, that the discussion is always about access to resources and access to land. And I'm, as an myself as an economist, I find it very problematic. Because it's not access to resources of the land, it's access to specific types of resources of land. I would like to have a thought on that, because I think you should be less hard on yourself. Thank you for a great day.
Now we'll hear from Bernard, and then you. And finally, yeah, I know.
My question is for Diogo also. I was wondering if you, when you ran the statistical program, if you factored in some social variables in order to test your hypothesis about the discorrelation that Patrick was talking about. And another question is, yes, we know that specific types of land matter most than others, or more than others, but you cannot consider the value of the lands only from an economical point of view. Spiritual resources may lay in lands that are not economically viable. So, spiritual in relation to the indigenous populations.
Building on what we said, I have very two downward questions to both of you. Right? The first one to Diogo. Have you considered taking account water resources in the variety of where locations to first, second, and third? I think you already use first, second, and third levels of water sets, depending on the stream they have. Have you considered taking this mechanism not only to produce the sugar, but also to transport it to the sea or afterwards to the market? And for you said, you skip, I think, and Silva, I don't know Silva is someone, I don't have to agree, I'm just for it. But have you seen if all of them they publish in Tadeo Ferreira research? Because when I saw, I think it's Tadeo Ferreira, the publishing house, do you think this plays a role on gathering this intellectual discourse of the nation, improvements and so on?
Amelia.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you so much for those so interesting papers. There would be a lot that maybe we can talk to the brain. To you, I just have some complexity to have the one to have presented us, and it was really fascinating and opening the ground, and it's very interesting. I just have some questions as a historian going to the ground. And one of them is that, okay, so you have families that have properties that have been given to them or acquired them, and most probably they are complex of properties that are not this kind of soil, but they need also, for instance, forest, wood for water and so forth. So what I mean is that one of the points of analysis was the composition of the soil, right? But how did they know what should be done by soil? What I mean is we got talking from the 16th century onwards, those properties, they were not experts, certainly, and I'm not a geologist. Would it be a kind of practical knowledge? But practical knowledge acquired where since sugar came to Brazil as a kind of important thing. So just how could they know? The other thing is that you make in the second graph an evolution on the Cavalcanti properties and the other ones, and over centuries, okay?
Yeah.
And you see there are different propositions in different centuries.
Yeah.
I imagine that you refer also to different mills, because we do know that also soils modify their characteristics with their own exploitation. So it's not clear for me if that evolution has to be with the transformation of the same soil, or if it was different properties in the same place. The other thing, I think the question that would be put forward, would you consider the water, would you consider the social thing, because all these modeling, they are fascinating, but they imply multivariables, which make it so difficult for us historians and mostly for us that are willing to work with us and our complexity. And of course, it was always a pleasure to listen to you and to learn with your papers. I was very grateful, well, in the end, you came to political, the success of the political approaches, because usually we think of political level in terms of legislation and so forth, and it's kind of what you said, policies, or public perceptions of things. And I cannot even, being a little bit economic or not, in my intervention, to think that it's not totally unnerved that the solutions for environmental problems are pointed out as technological or modernization or whatsoever, because nowadays the sustainability relies also in new technologies too. So you have the green technologies, you have engineering as their answer, and it is why the social sciences and humanities, they are not really taken in consideration, even for funding purposes, even for the calls of European, we are kind of flowers they put in the teams, because the idea is exactly that. The more urbanization goes in the sense that more technology, clean technology. But what is that, the clean technology? What is going to happen with all those batteries? What about the lithium thing? So, and those are considerations that even today, they are not taken into account. Just they were not taken into account the implications of the industrialization. That's why, for me, it's always very, very strange that today's politicians, and global policies do not take into account the history and all of it been talking about.
Okay, we'll take just a final question from Francisco.
I liked very much both papers. I'm very pleased. Thank you for bringing this, for bringing this study involving the social historians and biologists. I think that's very important. The interdisciplinarity we were talking about. And the correlations you presented here, I think they are very important. They are very important because you chose very well, your team chose very well the families which were there from the beginning, virtually. So they could choose, because I was wondering about the property market, but they could choose. They were at the beginning, they could choose. Others who came later, they would have scarcity, and they didn't have the same capacity. So I think you made a choice. On the other hand, thinking about the second, third generation, we could introduce the correlations because many of them, they chose the diversity of portfolio. And I have in my recent research on new Christians, I saw many of them investing in the sugar plantations in Brazil, but they had other investments, and they had investment in trade, so they were investing in different areas. But your work stands by itself because of the choice you made of those families. So, concerning the resolution, I think it's very important to go back and to reorganize all this comprehensive work on the Brazilian or Brazilian enlightenment concerning this reflection on nature. I was wondering, and that's I think this systematic approach is not there. We have, as you know, several good studies with non-comprehensive approach in that issue. And I was wondering how to relate the point of view of these authors with surveys.
What?
Surveys. Because I remember also Rodrigues Ferreira and how he went to the Amazon and how he organized the survey of that area and how he collected materials and how he
Surveys. I got sorry for
how
that.
he wrote also many aspects of information in the region. So, what was there really available for this reflection? Was it just, in many cases, the personal relation or other reflections? How did this, because in some cases we have centralized decisions, as the most but how can we integrate this procedure in this analysis of the environment?
Okay, so now we've taken several questions. We'll now go back to hear from our speakers. We'll perhaps follow the same order. So, Diogo, would you please care to comment?
Can you speak a bit more? I'm trying to think a bit. I was hoping you do a big discourse.
I could add another question, but
No. Yeah, well, thank you so much. You guys you're giving me a lot to think about. I'll try to cover all the questions minimally. Katja, thank you so much for both of your questions. On spatial capital, I remember that when I was very, very young, before going to Zé Augusto to talk about, my master's studies, I thought of doing a strictly theoretical dissertation on kind of a geography of Bourdieu. But did I tell you that? Because I had, taken as an undergrad this introductory module to anthropology, kind of an introduction to anthropology, some kind of. And I had read for the first time Bourdieu, and I was fascinated. And I wanted to do something geographical with his writings, but I was totally discouraged, if there is such a word, by a professor in the geography department. But anyway, what I want to say is that I don't have enough knowledge of Bourdieu's work to right now to advance theoretically on space, because I took this concept directly. Of course, the authors I drew on, they were of course dialoguing with Bourdieu, but I did not go directly to Bourdieu. I went actually to Jacques Lévy, the geographer, for this concept of spatial capital. But no doubt about it, there is room to advance a more habitus-like theory of capital and specifically spatial capital. So I'll keep that in mind. But yeah, there is absolutely about specific types of land. I could not agree more. It's not because one of the tasks of environmental history is to go down to earth in a sense, right? And do not talk about land in abstract, right? What we do have in the real world is specific spatial configurations of resources. And when I say resources, I'm very much aware that resources are for specific actors, right? What is a resource? What was a resource for European and New European planters were certainly not, or probably not, a resource for indigenous peoples, for example, right? And related to this, there is an interesting discussion about masape, about the origin of this word, masape, right? Perhaps it had a Tupi origin, but I'm not sure. I think it's related to amasa pé, like when you put your feet on the soil, it goes deep, right? Because it has this stickiness, right? But yeah, but I think masapi were not a thing. At least it's not in the sources for indigenous peoples. It was not an important. It was not a resource for them. Yeah, we can talk more about this later on. Social variables. I'm not sure what you had in mind with social variables, but I think we can include as a social variable, for example, the density and kind of native settlement, right? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That was important because, of course, in the early phases of the sugar economy in Brazil, labor force was basically indigenous, right? The enslavement of the indigenous people was the very first means of recruiting labor force. So I believe, although I don't have hard proof here, that one of the variables, one of the factors they had in mind was the existence of nearby sources of enslaved or enslavable labor, right? Not only economic, other kinds of value of the land. Well, thinking about the Portuguese European settlers, I'm not sure I can. There certainly. I can imagine that it was, from the perspective of native peoples, value to the land that was not strictly utilitarian, right? Things related with the ancestrals, the mythic trajectory of their cultural heroes. I can imagine there was this kind of dimension, but to be honest, I can't think of anything like that concerning the Portuguese, the European settlers in general. The role, Koldo asked about the role of water resources. The only variable we used to Koldo was the proximity to. You're right in mentioning that the river system is complex. There are, the main rivers and their tributaries and stuff. I'm not sure. I would have to talk to Cristiane about it, but I'm not sure we consider the hierarchy of the drainage system. But I have to check. But no, the only variable related to water we considered was proximity to kind of the nearby river or channel water. How that's very interesting, Amelia. How did they know, right? How could they know the quality of the land? There is this guy I quoted, the Italian Jesuit, Andrea João Antonio. You probably know him. He mentioned something like, the successful planter has to get information from the knowledgeable farmers, the elders, the people who were there already in the land, working the land. Newcomers they must talk to these older people to get information. But beyond that, I'm not aware of any qualitative sources indicating how did they acquire information about saw it, but that's certainly a major point, a major front of investigation I have to pursue. Absolutely. I'm running out of time. Perhaps we can, there are two more questions. Perhaps we can talk about them later on.
Later on.
Yeah.
Okay, then, Augusto, please. The mic.
Katia made a fascinating point to Diogo. Just quickly comment on it. This idea that it's not land on a general sense, but full land, full of ecological assets. And in contemporary agrarian reform, you mentioned the landless, some land that was gave us agrarian reform was almost deserted land in the Northeast. And there were complaints that the farmers, they sell the land to the state, and then the state distributes. So there were corruption because they sell horrible land to the state for agrarian reform. But depends on the historicity, because in the south of Brazil, when the Germans and Italians arrived, the oligarchy that controlled the Pampa, the plains for cattle ranching, they sent the migrants to the horrible land, which were the Atlantic forest in the mountains. Now we would consider it splendid tropical forests. But they had to deal, at that time it was considered a desert. And so it changed according to the perception of each time. I also remember a beautiful tale by Juan Rulfo, the Mexican writer, novelist, about some peasants getting a land for agrarian reform, just stones. And the land was just stones. And he worked it on a literary fashion on a very beautiful way. Anyway, going to the questions that were raised for me. Well, I think intellectual history is important as such, but of course not a simplistic intellectual history. I'm not trying to find the first one who started ecological awareness in the world, or to have a linear vision. It's a complex genealogy of all these concepts and what we can call key concepts of key words. They have a complex genealogy. I'm just trying to include in this complex genealogy a group, and we could discuss in terms of sociology of science or sociology of academic sociology, why Luso-Brazilian thinkers are not included in this history of environmental thought, because they were discussing on a deep way these problems, and it's important also not only as a history of ideas, but also because it helps to understand the social changes. Ideas do not exist in the void, so we can. I think it's very important to understand how environmental awareness appears in the modern world, and this is. We also are using these authors as documents, as historical documents, to investigate many aspects of Brazilian environmental history. Because the interesting thing is that when they went back to Brazil, they went to different regions. A little bit going to your point. In the Northeast, they were talking about dogs, about secas, dogs, droughts. In the Northeast, in the Southwest, they were talking about burnings or in the Northeast, burnings for plantation. In the Amazon, for us, well, it's a different case, Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira, but he was part of the same group of Vandellis students. But he wrote very little about deforestation. Deforestation was not a big issue in the Amazon forest, but he wrote about the predatory hunting of manatees or turtles. So depending on the region, they were giving clues for future environmental history, if you can say that way. But at the same time, you mentioned something very interesting. What were their concrete experience to talk about Brazil in such a way? Because Bonifácio had a very small experience of the Brazilian territory. It was between São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. But of course, they studied a lot. But they did not have, Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira had, because of his mission, but they did not have this idea of making a survey, of being systematic. they were doing political reflections and producing scientific observations according to their patterns of how to do it. But they were not doing something systematically. But in his writings, in his Brazilian writings, Bonifacio were preaching the need to do this kind of things, to create an academy of science, to do a survey of the different indigenous groups of the different parts of the territory. And an amazing systematic work in this direction was a production, this map by Frederick von Martius, the traveler, and he traveled 14,000 kilometers in Brazilian territory at the beginning of the 19th century, and he also read many different travelers, and he tried to make a map of, he called the provinces of flora in Brazil. It was the first time when he tried to make a systematic assessment of the different, we would call biomes or ecosystems of Brazil. But none of these authors did something similar. But they had this as something that must be done. They preach as something that had to be done in the future. So about the publishing house, some of them were publishing in the Arco do Cego printing project, which had to do with enlightening the Brazilian farmers with new ideas. Rodrigo Souza Coutinho was supporting, and many of these were, they produced this book, Fazendeiro do Brasil. Né? And I read some documents in at least 2 documents in 2 different regions saying, the local authorities saying what to do with these books. Nobody wants, the farmers do not want to read these books. They ignore these books, and Portugal are sending these books and what to do with these books. And it's interesting to see the other side. And and so about there is a tragic aspect in the history of these authors, because they were seriously thinking about the future. And this discussion went on in Brazil, in independent Brazil. But they did not have social actors that could support or do something on the political or on the public arena about these ideas. They were discussing among themselves all over the 19th century how that we had to change the relationship with the land, had to change the relationship with nature. But they were a little bit preaching to the state, but the state was completely dependent on the farmers, and so especially on the coffee farmers, because coffee became the focus of environmental discussions in the 19th century. And so this idea of modernization, it's something that is still here. When I started to publish these ideas, and I'm grateful because I have been working more now in my new projects are about the contemporary history of how to understand the Anthropocene in Brazilian history, or how to discuss the deforestation and conservation of the Atlantic forest, of the Amazon forest in the last decades. And I'm also working with the 19th century, colonial period. I have not been working. So I had to go again to this stuff. But when I started to publish about these documents, someone said that, well, this is different from present day environmentalism, because present day they were caring about economy, they were caring about political interests. They were not doing a pure environmental thought, pure environmental reflection. As if today it was a pure environmental reflection. It's more or less the same thing. The majority of the huge environmental debate in the world today has to do with the economic and economic consequences. So it's still. So I think it's not so. History is a game of continuity and change. Of course, today is very different, but at the same time, we are watching in this Luso-Brazilian stuff the raise of these concerns and more or less a certain kind of perception about the growth, about modernity, about applied science, technology, is still now. Technology is still being the where many of the states are trying to face these problems now with technological change, etc. So it's still the majority of to conclude, the majority of present-day environmental discussion in the world is related with how to combine modernization and survival, how to combine economic growth and survival. It's not that different from what they were trying to discuss on a completely different moment, but different and not different. So that's the complex dialectic of history.
Okay, so I think we can wrap up this session. We're running a bit behind schedule.
Give me just 30 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, I forgot to say something about how do they know about the soils. In the case of the Paraíba Valley of coffee plantations in the 19th century that I studied more closely, they discovered from some patterns they call padrões, like certain kinds of trees that indicated the soils behind. And also many farmers walk in the area. They walk with their own feet, their own legs, to feel the humus and to see if the humus was really strong and if the soil will be good for coffee plantation. In the 19th century, I don't know if they did the same in the colonial period.
Okay, so we're now going to coffee. Thank you, all the speakers.
Desculpa, vamos ver aqui qual. Não, desculpa. Peraí, vamos tirar aqui com calma. São essas aqui, tá bom.
Roubando a apresentação dos outros.
Não quero roubar a apresentação.